Thank you very much. I hope you had something good to eat. The food downstairs was lovely. I know I had a very fast bite amongst running around. We now move into the last two sessions of the day. The first session that we're about to do is around human rights and around sports obligations to protect human rights and workers' rights when appointing countries and cities as hosts for mega events. Please roll the tape.
Despite having an established code of ethics, FIFA has a history of selecting hosts with varying degrees of human rights abuses. Prior to Brazil's 2014 tournament, a number of protesters took to the streets to demand action was taken to build secure infrastructure for the country's citizens before committing to the significant financial burden of a World Cup. The Russian World Cup takes place despite denial of rights for some citizens and other abuses of sporting integrity. In Qatar, they have had a labour law known as kafala, which has virtually enslaved migrant workers from Southeast Asia and elsewhere. Yet FIFA could use its World Cup to effect positive change for the sport, for people, for communities and for nations. But FIFA doesn't. The question must be asked, should sport contribute to safeguarding human rights? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back David Eads.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that welcome. Let's get straight into this panel session. I'm going to expand a little bit on what we heard there before I introduce our panelists. Does sport have a responsibility to ensure human rights? Now, that sector that we know of as sport in its various guises, there is that argument that it has to be kept separate from politics. Sport is a special case. We hear that very often. It's not just a business or even a business. It shouldn't be a political football either. It deserves autonomy in the way it operates. But where do human rights fit into that perspective? I think it goes without saying these days, almost every day that passes, this becomes more relevant. Sport at the highest level is arguably one of the most powerful tools for effecting change. And that can be social change through role models, through its mass appeal, financial clout, and its avowed readiness to spread the reach of sports across the globe. Certainly that's true of football. And when sport does play a role in a political issue, the development of a country to an attempt, for example, to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula, well then those in positions of power within sport are very quick to wave a flag, to champion the power of sport to do good. And I think that is fair enough, indeed valuable. Surely sport also, per se, I guess, is as close as you get to being a human right for most people in itself. It's not something only the rich and the privileged should be allowed to play or indulge in, and it's not something which enables some people to thrive off the misfortunes of others to enjoy. So what are the obligations of sport? That's of teams, of players, of international federations, leagues, tournaments, you name it. In a football context, what are the duties of sport in handing out some of those massive prizes, World Cups and the like? And how far should FIFA or indeed any other organisation be using its clout to effect social change in the process? After all, FIFA's promise is for the game, for the world. It's a big promise to make. We're going to tackle some of the glaring issues surrounding the World Cup finals and the hosts for 2018 and 2022. That will lead us to discussion of LGBT and kafala, indentured work. We'll get various different expressions of what kafala actually is in Qatar, and I think it's important to get that definition. But the International Trade Union Congress has simply called it slave labour. If it's felt that these countries should be doing better and should be doing more, well, what is the responsibility of sport to act? Our panel is the sort of panel that can take this at a very high level indeed, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome four extremely accomplished individuals in the realm of human rights in any case. The first of which is Geoffrey Robertson QC. Geoffrey is a barrister, academic, a writer. Do come up, Geoffrey, and take a pew. A broadcaster as well. He's the founder and joint head of Doughty Street Chambers, a master of the bench at the Middle Temple, a visiting professor of Queen Mary University of London, a very familiar figure in the human rights space, if I can put it that way. Geoffrey, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Dr. Alan Mendoza is the founder and the executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. The Henry Jackson Society is a think tank which is built on principles of democracy and human rights, civil rights, and indeed the environment as well. Alan, thank you for being with us. Hussein Haqqani is the former Pakistani ambassador to the United States and indeed to Sri Lanka. He is a journalist, an academic, a political activist, a writer, and has written countless articles for some of the most esteemed journals, from the New York Times to Foreign Affairs. Currently a senior fellow and director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute. Hussein, very nice to have you on board. Thank you. And our fourth contributor, well, you'll be heartily sick of him by the end of the day. However, Jamie is, we know where Jamie's heart lies and where his campaigning zeal comes from. And this is one of those areas which I know touches deep into his core. And it's extremely important that we hear, Jamie, what has driven you on, not least in the area of Qatar, which we'll come to in a minute. But before we do that, Geoffrey, I want to start with you, if I can. You know, every country has its laws. And those laws are agreed across that land. And they clearly need to be respected because that is the law of the land. And I wonder where that leaves issues like human rights when you're considering a big, bold program that you want to offer out there to everyone.
Well, there is another law. It's international law, and it's international human rights law. I'll tell you something very funny. There is no international human right to sport. Incredible. Why was this? Because after the war, when the Human Rights Acts were being put together, sport had, the 1936 Nazi Olympics had been degraded. Okay, sport was something that could be exploited for political purposes. Now, if you ask me to create a right to sport, I'll easily argue it, because sport, we have a right to physical well-being, and sport is part of that. We have a right to our personality, and sport has become part of that. We have a right to our culture, and sport is part of that. So there is no doubt that although sport is not mentioned, you can put together a human right to sport. Now, at what point does the sport, particularly international sport, owe some duty to international human rights law? This was fought out in the 60s over apartheid, over a country which would not put any black or colored person in a sports team. And Britain, the awful, immoral MCC, actually obeyed the South African apartheid by refusing to choose Basil Dolabira in their team. And it took Peter Hain, the protester, running on cricket pitches, stopping sport, stopping the playing of sport with apartheid. But all the sports administrators said, oh no, we're not going to do that. We can't mix politics and sport, not realizing perhaps that South Africa was using these games as an endorsement. And it goes back to 1971, the sports responsibilities, and it was enunciated by the greatest cricketer ever, Sir Donald Bradman, who was head of the Australian Cricket Board. Would Australia in 1971 play Test cricket with South Africa? No, said Bradman, we will not play with them until they select teams on a non-racial basis. And for 21 years, Australia didn't, Britain didn't, and so it became it became important from 1971 onwards for sport to acknowledge international human rights. And we're going to talk about 50 years on what that duty requires today and whether FIFA and indeed the OAC should be part of the international human rights system.
You used the word duty, which I'm going to take to you, Alan. Is it a duty of sport to play that role?
Well, I think it's a duty of sport to be cognizant of what the great jewels in its calendar can mean to countries and to individuals around the world, and the actions that are taken by sporting bodies. There's a duty to understand the implications of those. So let's look, for example, in the context of football and the World Cup, which we're talking about. Why is it that FIFA, the body that supposedly represents international football, isn't thinking about the messaging that it sends out when it grants a regime like Qatar the World Cup? Why is it not doing that? Why is it thinking that an absolute monarchy in its way, with human rights abuses, with no footballing history? How can it possibly be a sensible message to be sending out as a responsible organisation to the rest of the world in that sort of process? And that's, I think, the duty we need to focus. The international human rights law issue is one issue. Then there is a question of how we should be behaving in international organizations around this. Of course, sport has a power to unite, but it has a power to divide as well. And this is a clearly divisive issue, because if you say to autocratic regimes of various kinds, you don't need to reform, it's fine, we're going to give you all the benefits regardless of what you do, then what messaging are you sending and what duty are you upholding? And that, I think, is a question that needs to be asked repeatedly, both in the past and in the future, when we consider these things going forwards.
I'll come back to that issue of what the message is actually about whether or not they need to reform in the process of getting a big sporting event. But Hussein, we talk about sport and politics, whether they should mix or not, human rights and sport. Your perspective?
Well, my basic point would be that human rights are not politics. Human rights should be considered above politics. And I agree with Jeffrey. I disagree with him describing Sir Don Bradman as the greatest cricketer ever. Coming from the subcontinent, we have to have some other candidates, but we'll let that one pass right now.
Jamie have the deciding vote.
Yeah.
He's Australian.
He's Australian.
But going to the subject of human rights, I think that the one thing that is the duty of sports bodies is not to allow bad regimes to use sport as a means of legitimizing themselves and respectabilizing themselves. That's a very important consideration. Because there are certain things on which there can be no ambiguity. And the example of South Africa was important, and the apartheid regime. But there are other factors as well. Qatar was mentioned by Alan. Let me cite the example of Qatar. Here's a country that supports backers of terrorism. Here's a country that has now become...
Allegedly, this is a defamation being put about, and there's never been any satisfactory independent...
Well, there are individuals
inquiry
within that country that have been named as sponsors or financiers of terrorism. And so that may be disputed by some, but at the same time, it is something that does not necessarily enhance the legitimacy of sporting activity there. It is true that it is not a major football playing country. In fact, the largest population there is of Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis who would rather play cricket than football. There are only 313,000 Qataris. They are not distinguished for playing football. Why did Qatar spend so much money? And they're spending more money. There's going to be air-conditioned stadia, etc., built by almost indentured labor.
No, but Hussein, hold on.
Let me complete my thought.
Hold on a minute, because half of these issues are not human rights issues.
I'll tell you why they are. Let me try and explain to you why they are human rights issues. They are human rights issues because the reason why the Qataris want to do this is so that they do not come under introspection or examination for their human rights.
Oh, that's just anti-Qatar politics. Please concentrate on the issue.
Well, we can talk about Russia.
Yes,
we
indeed.
can talk about Russia, indeed, which is just round the corner. My point is that whether it is Qatar, whether it's Russia, the very fact that the sporting bodies do not take into consideration the motivations for why these regimes are willing to, these authoritarian regimes, they are willing to spend large amounts of money buying individual members of the FIFA, of the FIFA body to try and get this sporting event. There is a reason, and that reason is not sport. That reason is to whitewash their own record. And that is my argument for why sports bodies should actually take an active interest in figuring out what the heck is the motive, and are we becoming part of something that has nothing to do with sport.
Okay, important point about motivation. I was going to start with Russia on a chronological 2018-2022. I feel like we're steering straight into Qatar, so let's do that.
Wait, I'm sorry, I'd like to talk a little bit of Russia, if I can.
Well, you will get there, Jamie, but we're going to do Qatar first.
Okay,
We will come to Russia. Trust me, we have the time. But, and this is a very important area for you, let's be honest.
Although Qatar is the one that we are having a dispute over, Russia, I don't think we have a dispute across the panel.
Well, let's get the meat out at the top then, shall we?
Fair enough.
Fine. I want to know, but first of all, we can talk about some of the issues Hussein has brought up. But if you are looking at Qatar and the power of sport to affect change, well, actually, isn't this a really good example, Jamie, of how sport is affecting change in Qatar, having given it the World Cup?
No, I disagree, and because it's called leverage. And the time that you use your leverage is before you hand over the crown jewels. And I'm greatly disappointed that FIFA, in their wisdom in 2009, didn't say to the Qataris, look, we're happy to engage with you hosting a World Cup, but we will not have it built on the back of slavery. And therefore, if you want to host the World Cup, the price is you must reform your labour system. And that was a point, a huge point that was missed. And it's interesting when you look at what they looked at through the evaluation process. There wasn't any consideration given to human rights. There wasn't any consideration given to that indentured slavery. And I do feel very passionately about this, David, because I've been there, I've seen it, and I've been horrified with what I saw. I've got a little film that I'd like to show, just to, if I can set a little bit of context. We wanted to do something around FIFA. We wanted to put a human face on the price of suffering, a human face on the price of corruption within FIFA. And we sat down and thought about it, and we thought, you know what, we think it's Nepalese workers, as an example, that are constructing 2022 infrastructure. And I might add, there's always an interesting conversation about the definition of World Cup infrastructure. FIFA worked very hard to restrict the definition of World Cup infrastructure to stadiums. We believe very strongly that World Cup infrastructure is everything. It's hotels, it's airports, it's railways, it's roads. I mean, everything that's going on. I mean, the previous panel talked about they didn't even have sufficient cities. I think Harold Mayne-Nichols said there weren't enough cities to host it, so they're building a city. So I hopped on a plane in end of March 2015 and flew to Doha, and there was a lovely lady who was able to, she was my fixer, and she got me smuggled into labour camps. And I came in literally in the back of a four-wheel drive in the footwell under a blanket, and got in and had a chap with a small camera followed me around. And I took some footage, and if we can just roll this and you can see some of the stuff that I saw.
Okay, let's go.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you answer?
Yeah.
Where are they from?
आप किधर का है? नेपाल से.
Nepal?
So,
This is
the kitchen. Yeah.
have a look. Have a look inside. Eight beds.
Okay.
How long are you here? How long?
कितना साल हुआ इधर? 2 years.
And how much does he get paid?
कितना सैलरी आपका
1200 वो हम खाना पीना
And now, I'm an Australian, and we never swear. But that was shit all over the floor in that bathroom. Now, just to explain something to you, this is the wealthiest nation on earth. It's not on the sewer system. It's on the old-fashioned bring in the sewerage truck, pop the hose in and pump it out, however, every period. And literally, these workers had to wait until the bosses had pumped it out, and the bosses hadn't pumped it out, and the toilets were overflowing. Just after I was there, a bit later on, they had the earthquakes in Kathmandu. Because I was with these Nepalese workers, what became clear was that there were Nepalese workers were denied the opportunity to go back to Kathmandu and Nepal for funerals of their families because it was interfering with the construction timeline. This is indentured slavery. This is the system. When the workers arrive, they hand over their passport. Their passports are kept by their employers. They cannot leave the country without a signed certificate from their employer. It's a terrible state to be in. And what was really upsetting for me was when in talking to these guys, they are trapped. And you look them in the eyes and they know they're trapped. But what makes it even more upsetting is some of them are coming back. They do their 2 years, they go back for 3 months, and then they come back again because they have no choice. But David, the thing that really struck most in this whole scenario is that if FIFA had said to Qatar, if you reform your labour laws, we will engage with you to host the World Cup. And they missed this amazing opportunity to not only say, we've put an event in that's created the employment of 2 million people that are some of the most unemployable people in the world, but to do so with a sense of dignity. And so for me, it's very clearly incumbent on the sporting federation, because I'm not a human rights organisation. I'm in the business of sport, and my leverage is in the business of sport. And it's clear that we want these sporting federations, and whether it's FIFA, whether it's the IOC, and I will get to Russia eventually, you'll let me and talk about Sochi, or whether it's this farce of a thing called the European Games going to Baku, and the ongoing human rights issues that are happening there.
Yes,
but this is a major problem.
Can I say that, just go finish up on that, Jamie is absolutely right. There should, in 2009, 2010, there should forever after, when games are awarded, be an audit with the Human Rights Committee or Human Rights Council. Indeed, the Human Rights Commissioner should be invited to give a report on the contenders. And it may be that certain countries would not have been invited. But the power of sport to influence for the good comes in this way. Qatar got the 2022 World Cup. In 2014, a year before Jamie's film, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty exposed the kafala system. One worker dying a day from the bad designs of the stadiums and the failure to implement the rugby system by independent subcontractors. That was a Qatar admission. And then in 2015,
Jeffrey,
Jamie,
can I challenge that?
No, wait a minute.
Finish, then we'll come to you.
You make your film in 2015. And there is some pressure. And what happens? Qatar reforms the kafala system. The International Labour Organization, and Sharon Burrows, who's the head of the International Trade Union Organization, this year says that they're content, they're satisfied that the kafala system is ending in Qatar. So that seems to me an example of the power of sport to effect human rights changes.
I'll challenge that notion that you put forward, that there's been transparency with regards to deaths. There hasn't been.
Right.
There hasn't been, and it's been one of the issues that human rights organisations have struggled with, is to get statistics. And we have seen an absolute reluctance and refusal to communicate and to give that sort of information. Look, there's no doubt in my mind there have been some incremental improvements, but we are such a long way away from where we need to be. We're also years after this process has started, and if this had been done the right way, there would have been...
I agree.
Well, let me just take
the right way
this to, I want to
initially.
take this to Hussein, because the point Geoffrey makes about the ILO, I think, is very significant to many people beyond sport. They condemned kafala, they've withdrawn that condemnation and said Qatar is doing something about it. Now, of course, there are plenty of your countryfolk.
Well, my argument would be,
well. Would you...
my argument would be that even ILO, in fact, I am now a critic of all multilateral sort of international bodies, because look, let's go back to something Jamie said about Baku being the next event. Why is there a pattern? Don't you see the pattern? Russia gets one World Cup, Qatar gets the next, Baku is able to... All the bad regimes that are under the spotlight for bad human rights conduct, they are now getting into the game of bidding for games. And they are getting international support, and they're doing it with a reason. Now, as far as these incremental adjustments are concerned, I call them adjustments, not really reforms. Why? And then you get somebody like the ILO, which is another multilateral organization where you also, again, lobby a few governments. And I've been a diplomat, and I know how that's done. I was in the United States at a time when Pakistan was being accused of having bin Laden there. So I know how you kind of go and say, yeah, but we are making incremental changes. Can you at least say this, and can you do that? This incremental business, either there is fundamental change or there isn't. Now, if anyone on this panel is willing to say that there is fundamental change on the anvil in Qatar, I'm prepared to listen to that.
Well, it's
otherwise,
fundamental to abolish the system.
Otherwise,
it still exists in Saudi and UAE.
Well, as far as Saudi and UAE are concerned, they are not on our list of topics today for the simple reason that they haven't been given a major sporting event.
But change, whether it's big or small, it has affected a change.
It remains to be seen whether that change is anywhere lasting. I think
You've got 4 years.
Let me give
4 years to go.
4 years
First of
to
that,
go.
it also remains to be seen, Geoffrey, whether it is actually sport that's made that judgment, or in fact a collection of other geopolitical factors, both in the region and beyond, which has shown Qatar to be a problem not just in human rights, but in the funding of extremism. Not terrorism there, but extremism.
Issue.
No, it is not I'm sorry.
No,
it is not a different issue.
It is not a different issue. It is something.
Let Alan speak.
I'll tell you why it's not a different issue, because it relates to the nature of the regime in that sense. You have a regime that hasn't respected human rights to date, even if it's tinkered here and there. You have a regime that, so much funding for extremists.
This is an attack on Qatar, is it? I thought we were talking about...
No, it's not an attack on Qatar. It is
And are you here to defend Qatar? Is that what we are coming down to?
It's not
attack
an attack
on Qatar.
It's stating the reality of the situation, which is that FIFA have granted the crown jewel of their sporting calendar to a regime that abuses human rights and funds extremism. They shouldn't have done. That's the whole point. This is what we're talking about.
And Russia got it.
Sport can...
But I want to just give an example.
Improve the situation.
But I want to give an example about this.
Hold on. Look, this is great.
The award.
Entertaining.
Here's my question for Geoffrey.
Shush. Let me give you one last
I need a little bit of
OSCE,
control
Kazakhstan.
here. That's why I'm sitting here. If we have 28 minutes and 8 seconds of this.
Yes.
That's
No, we
rubbish.
don't want that.
Come on, that's rubbish. So let's
me give
hear
you a
what people have
concrete
to say.
example.
You're all bright, intelligent people with good things to say. So I don't want quite so much cutting across each other. You finish, Alan.
Let me one small concrete example of Geoffrey's point. Kazakhstan and the OSCE presidency some time ago, I think it was 2010. In the run-up to that, they promised they'd make all these adjustments. They started making adjustments. The minute they got the presidency, it all snapped back again. What possible guarantee do we have that this won't happen here? There is none. The regime does not believe in human rights. That's the problem here.
Well, we must
Did Russia improve in the 4 years since it was given? We are 2 months away. What has changed in Russia by the award of the World Cup to them that we start believing in these so-called incremental changes? Look, I don't want to attack Qatar. They are a brotherly Islamic country as far as I'm concerned. I would like them to reform, but then I would like all other 57 Islamic countries to reform as well, which is why I live in the United States and not in one of the 57. However, let me just say that this is not about attacking anybody individually. And if you feel that way, I'm sorry that we made you feel that way. The question is, Qatar is a relatively easier example to talk about because it's still four years away and something can be done about it. The games can be cancelled. The World Cup can be cancelled, can be taken away from them. It can be given to somebody else who can prepare for it in 4 years. In case of Russia, we didn't have this discussion 4 years earlier. Otherwise, we could have created some kind of debate about that too. My point is that I agree with Alan that the nature of the regime does matter. And what the international sports community needs to start thinking about is why, I will repeat the point I made earlier, why is it that bad regimes with bad human rights records, oppressive regimes, are the ones that are willing to spend large amounts of money to get sporting events? And it is not because those sporting events pay for themselves, it is for legitimacy and respectability, and I think that needs to be denied to them. If we can get some reform out of it, so much the better, but the reform should be negotiated before rather than something that happens inadvertently as a process of things being exposed. If these people hadn't exposed what was happening in Qatar with these films, and by the way, everybody who went to expose did come under scrutiny and they were all packed up and sent back. So it wasn't a voluntary process that they really wanted to reform and they were just waiting to get the World Cup and then they wanted to reform and they reformed. The pressure should have started earlier, as Jamie points out.
But can I just say, because I'm coming to you, Jamie, on this, by accident or design, the focus has been, and you've been out there to create some of that focus, has been on kafala in Qatar. If Qatar had been challenged to scrap kafala, if they wanted to bid for these games, they might have walked away.
Then let them walk away.
Fine. But then what would be happening in Qatar today?
No,
because it's not as if they're only building a World Cup.
David, I'm sorry. Let them walk away. There are minimum standards expected in the international world. And look, before we get on to your favourite subject, which is Russia, I want to try and bring it back and stop these three gentlemen from beating the crap out of each other.
This is very tame, Jamie.
Yeah.
Look, I'm a shy Australian. I don't understand. I want to get it back, bring it back to the sport, to the issue of sport, and to the issue of FIFA, because we sat here. Or I didn't sit here, but we heard on the last panel, Harold Mayne-Nichols from Chile, who drove that evaluation process, where they looked at 9 countries. There were 4 in Europe and 5 in the rest of the world. And the country that he told me in a break, the country that topped the European list was England, and the country that came fourth was Russia. And I don't know how you go through that process, do the evaluation, apply those ratings, and end up with Russia. And then for the rest of the world, the country that came 5th with the highest ranking of risk associated with it is Qatar. And then as you've got to think about where is the logic, and then you overlay all this other stuff. And I know that it's nuance about whether it will potentially do something in the future in incremental improvements. I still think that even though we're talking about human rights, this still comes back to, for my mind, the legitimacy of the 2022 World Cup.
Well, how should we go about? Let's reach an agreement at least that human rights should be taken into account in the selection of a country. How do we do that in a way that isn't propagandistic, Western, Eastern, whatever? The only way we can do it is from the Human Rights Council of the United Nations and a report from the Human Rights Commissioner, currently Prince Zayed, to the selection body. That somehow the IOC and FIFA must be locked in to the UN human rights system and get an objective report. And it may be that if those reports had been objective in 2009, 2010, Russia and Qatar would not have got
Well, there's a very, very significant, I think, idea there. I mean, in FIFA's new statute says, amongst other things, on human rights, since last year, FIFA is committed to respecting all internationally recognized human rights and shall strive to promote the protection of these rights. Discrimination of any kind is strictly prohibited and punishable by suspension or expulsion. FIFA is committed to addressing discrimination in all its forms. Now, Jamie, on that issue of incremental change, those are changes.
Sorry, I don't believe those until I absolutely see them. There have been too many occasions, particularly with FIFA, when they've put things on a piece of paper that mean absolute rubbish. Right? We've seen this with Miguel Maduro before, with the Governance Committee. We've seen it with Cornel Borbally, with the Ethics Committee. We've seen it Professor Mark Peet as well. There is a litany of examples of times when they've talked the talk but not walked the walk. And part of what I strongly believe is that if we are to see FIFA, and I was about to say rediscover its integrity, no, I'll say discover integrity. Yeah. If we are to see FIFA discover integrity, there has to be some kind of some kind of atonement for the things that have been done. And so I would like to see a specific investigation into 2022. I mean, I'm still finding it very difficult to understand how you come 9th out of 9 countries and you go through a very significant evaluation process, how you have the sorts of issues that we've been talking about, and how you play a game, you propose to play it in the middle of summer, which everybody knew was never going to happen in the middle of summer. It's now changed to winter, which has completely screwed up 54 European competitions. I mean, completely, right? So there was no question of it ever being happening in summer, and you know that those 22 people that sat around the table that voted, they knew very well. And they decided, well, you know what, and I'll say it, they were incentivised, in my opinion, and I would like to know how.
Okay.
Repressive regimes have an advantage in the FIFA system, and they have an advantage because lack of transparency then enables them to get away with corruption. That's why this is happening. That's why Russia got theirs. That's why Qatar got theirs. And when you say, you just cited the amendment to the FIFA statute, my question there is, will we see, for example, LGBT rights being guaranteed everywhere as a result of this? That's not going to happen. We know that. It's not. Russia hasn't changed anything on that score. Qatar is not going to change it. Qatar still has stoning to death as one of the punishments because their argument is that it's part of Sharia law. Will we have transparency on that? So my point is that the earlier panels about corruption and this panel about human rights actually do tie up, because it's the corruption that enables violators of human rights to get these huge sports events, and then during the course of that event, all we will be focusing on, and we are all sports lovers, we will be focusing on the sport. And then we will be told, well, yes, all of those little things, they were important, some incremental change has come about it, and those countries and their suffering people will go back to what they were enduring before, while the regimes who got these events to showcase themselves as normal states, they will get away with that process of legitimacy and normalization.
Okay, I should just say, I think it's fair to be guarded in suggesting at all or inferring that Western democratic countries bidding do it in a rather gentlemanly way.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not
regimes that we don't like do it in a
I've been in Trinidad.
We can have another
knew
panel
about Jack Warner. Everyone.
Sure.
And they were proud of him.
Sure.
You know, they were proud of how corrupt he was, how good he was at getting money for himself, and, of course, for their own sports. You know, so there was
this is not about West and East. I mean, I want that to be clear. I'm not saying that.
Okay,
Not about West and East, but I think you're right. Hussein is right to point out the problem that repressive regimes do have an advantage in organisations like FIFA, and I'm afraid at the UN as well, Jeffrey. I mean, you cited the Human Rights Council. The idea the Human Rights Council is going to say boo to a goose to Qatar.
Well, no, I think that
isn't.
you
You know
have
how the UN
Commissioner
works.
of Human Rights, who's a man of enormous integrity, Prince Said.
Now,
if you have
right,
him,
the commissioner saying
if
something
the
different to the Human
commissioner
Rights Council saying
addresses FIFA, addresses the IOC,
Right.
then maybe some of these countries will never be selected. And
Fine, that's different. That's different, though,
That's the
to the Human
power.
Rights Council. And those are two different things. You're
Yeah,
right. I
no,
think
the
if
Human
the-
Rights Commissioner is
Yes,
what I
the
mean.
Human Rights Council is a joke and is dictated by politics, where repressive regimes have an advantage. But you're right that that could be an interesting route to start getting figures like that, giving assessments to stop it. Because I guarantee you, had that been the case, Russia and Qatar would never have had the World Cup. Would have been
And if
embarrassed
one
by
World
it.
Cup is withdrawn, one World
Yes.
Cup is withdrawn over human rights, I assure you
The message.
that will actually send a message that will result in serious change, not just incremental change, but serious change in attitudes of many regimes, because in many countries, sports is important to the people and enough for them to react. And if something can be done on that score, maybe we will have significant change in the years to
Okay, pause just for a moment there. We're going to move on to Russia.
Hey,
Jamie, the LGBT issue is obviously one which is foremost in everyone's minds as people are heading out there right now. It is not illegal. Homosexuality is not illegal in Russia. It is, in terms of public opinion, not approved of. What is your perspective then on whether or not Russia should be allowed to host finals with that as the backdrop?
let's be practical, because I can't tell you the exact dates, but I know that Sochi was February 14. It wasn't long before that Vladimir Putin floated legislation to, I don't think, was it to criminalise homosexuality, or was it to criminalise
the advocacy of...
Criminalise the advocacy
Right.
of homosexuality.
And my issue with that was the silence emanating out of Lausanne from the IOC. And I would have killed to have seen Thomas Bach go and see Vladimir Putin and just mention to him that they've committed $54 billion to constructing that event, and point out to him that obviously they're doing that for the propaganda value that the Olympics brings and to showcase the country. Beijing did it, it was all about the point in their cycle and their life that it makes sense to open China up to the rest of the world. And Sochi was about that as much as it was about egos, I'm sure. But if I would have loved to have seen Mr. Buck go to Mr. Putin and say, if you proceed with doing this, I'm going to get all our sponsors together and we're going to come out and publicly condemn the notion of what you're doing in terms of suppressing LGBT rights. And we do have a very strong view about this, because whilst Jeffrey correctly points out that there is no human right for sport, we believe very strongly that sport is a human right. And we like to say that, it doesn't matter whether you're black or white, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're straight or gay, whether you're male or female, whether you're Christian, Jew, agnostic or Muslim. Everybody has a right to get to the starting line on equal terms. Once the gun goes, you're on your own. And if I look at Jeffrey and my country, Australia, we're the only country in the world with 4 professional football codes. No other country has got 4 professional football codes. And across those 4 professional codes, we have something like 1,500 to 1,600 men playing a game of football every year, professionally. You've got to go back to 1993 to find the one and only time when we've had an out gay footballer of any code. I mean, that is a horrendous indictment. And when you consider that if you would mention something like that in the form of the arts, whether you're talking about whether it's people on the stage or people on the screen or people in dance or what have you, or music, it could never happen. But what is it about sport that does that? So the very notion that you are not prepared to proactively do something in that basis, because Buck couldn't have taken the Sochi Games away. I get that. But what he could have done is he could have sent a very strong message.
No, but can you hold to account FIFA or here the FA for the attitudes, the cultural attitudes within any given sport?
You've got to remember,
it feels
of
like
course,
that's what you do
It's
want.
called leadership, Dave.
Sharia law oppresses women, and at least half the countries have Sharia law. And I wonder how many women are on the FIFA Council. I wonder how many women are at the IOC. A fraction. How many women at this conference? All male. I feel a bit awkward. The last panel was all male. 18 men against 2 women. Is this a reflection, perhaps, of the denigration of women's sports, or of the lack of equality given to women in the sport? We've had the BBC, of course, being revolutionized, really. You've probably lost some salary, given it up for, for women.
Some are more equal than others. You know.
Yeah, well, we could have had Claire Balding, let's face it. But no, we've got to be conscious of human rights, and the basic human right is that of equality between men and women. And that is something that sporting bodies really have to look at.
Alan, can I ask you again, it's only partially about LGBT in Russia, really,
Sure.
but I know that you have a view that, okay, that's the totem issue at the moment, but there's a lot more besides, which might be perhaps better steers as to why Russia would not be an ideal host.
Frankly, it's incomprehensible how Russia is the host of this year's World Cup. If you look at Russia's behaviour over the past few years, even before the World Cup was granted, but certainly since then, when you see, firstly, you've got the LGBT issues, you've got general human rights issues in terms of suppression of democracy, suppression of opposition, the way the criminal code has been manipulated to just jail people who the regime decides is a problem. You've had the foreign adventurism, the invasion of Crimea, the invasion of Donetsk through other means, essentially. You've had the support for the murder in Syria that Putin's been putting. And also you've got this the Skripals here, poisoning. How on earth are we going to Russia to play football in 2 weeks' time? How is that possibly happening? It makes no sense at all. And it also makes no sense when you consider that a good number of the higher echelon of Russian officials who will be turning up to those games are banned from entering many other countries around the world. They have travel bans, or they've got asset issues, sanctions on them for human rights abuses. So you take this in totality, you wonder how on earth it got there. Of course, it's too late now, just as the Sochi issue is to pull it at this point. It might have been sensible, although that would have been very, I think, difficult for governments to do, to boycott those games, just as we, in the past, boycotted Olympic Games. There have been Olympic 82.
Well, in 82, and
Yes.
that's usually seen as a mistake.
Well, you say
It was Reagan's
yes.
decision, and followed by a lot of pro-American countries, and it didn't really work.
Well, it didn't work except in the sense that there was clearly an embarrassment factor to the Soviets in 80 for the
But
Moscow.
they went ahead.
It was
Well, they went ahead,
Carter's
it's true.
decision, by the way.
It was Jimmy Carter's decision, yes, exactly. It was the 80 Olympics. So
Yes.
decision there. And Jimmy Carter was a human rights president. That was one thing he certainly put to the fore. But it would seem to me that, you need to look at those decisions, how you make them, and when there is still time to act, like in 2022, can we do something about it now? Let's do something. Let's make a statement for once, rather than talking about it and say, we're going to make a statement, this isn't working, this is a grand gesture to show that in future we are going to take this very seriously.
You liaise very neatly into another area of responsibility and leadership, possibly, Alan, which maybe I'll start with you on, Hussein. We're talking about FIFA's role in saying, right, let's bring the axe down on Qatar or on Russia, whatever. What about the sponsors? What about the broadcasters? What about the individual athletes who are preparing to go out and compete?
I think that everybody has a responsibility in varying degrees. Sponsors definitely can deny responsibility, but in certain cases, like Qatar again, they don't really care about the sponsors as much because the state will be able to compensate for it. They've got enough money. There may be other events where the difference would be made by sponsors. But look, first of all, I think that the entire decision-making process has to, as everybody here has said, start taking human rights into consideration. Second, this pattern of repressive regimes bidding for and getting more and more major global sports events and being willing to put in the amounts, large amounts, or promise at least large amounts. It's interesting that Russia, Qatar, Azerbaijan, all oil economies, that they're willing to put that money and nobody wants to question them about anything else. Nobody raises questions about human rights. Nobody raises questions about aggression in case of Russia. Nobody raises questions about conflict with other states. that process should change. People should start asking those very critical questions, which are not asked, whether they relate to gender equality, whether they relate to LGBT rights. Basically, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights needs to be taken a lot more seriously in relation to allowing nations to showcase themselves as major sporting sites. Look, what has changed is that with television and sports being as big as it has become, this is not the 1920s, when having a major sporting event was just for the pleasure of those who could make it there. Now everybody around the world enjoys them. There is a dimension other than just having the game or the sport at that particular site. And I think choosing sites for major global events should have a process that should take into consideration more than one, who is able to pay for it, and two, who's able to pay for FIFA officials so that they would vote for that country.
Jeffrey, could I come to you? Go on, Jamie, quickly.
Just quickly, because we have to remember all this in context of, again, there was an investigation into the Russian bid, and Russia said, I'm terribly sorry, we have thrown out our computers. So in the 21st century, I mean, that's bad enough as it is, but what makes it far worse is the fact that FIFA said, oh, okay, thank you very much.
No, but I think I understand.
Yes, and at Sochi, after all, Putin did release everyone from Michael Khodorkovsky, the oligarch wrongly imprisoned, to Pussy Riot in time to look better at Sochi. But essentially, we've got to work out a procedure. You must have a mechanism. And I think the mechanism is the report of the Commissioner for Human Rights to FIFA, to the Olympic Committee, whenever they choose. But then, they're choosing 8 or 12 years ahead. So there has to be some independent body. Let's forget the fight between Saudi and Qatar. There has to be an independent body to monitor the human rights record and to report back every year on the human rights record of the country that gets the particular games.
And there has to be some accountability for what has already happened. So I think that, for example, in case of Russia, if it's too late, at least the next one, which we still have 4 years, I think at least some action has to be taken that shows that this is not just about, as Jamie said, okay, if people have done wrong, it can't be just individuals. States and governments and kingdoms should not have the right to just use individuals as scapegoats. They never get punished. Nobody's been punished inside Russia either. Nobody's been punished in Qatar for bribery scandals. Individuals have been named, made, scapegoated, but that's it. Somebody should pay for misconduct while we develop the mechanism so that both these things can happen and human rights can come center stage.
On that point, there is an interesting development which we should have in the back of our minds. It's called the Magnitsky Act.
Yep.
And we have a Sanctions Act passed last week. It's the sort of thing that will get Russian oligarchs in difficulty. It is the idea of taking the power in your own country to freeze the accounts of human rights violators from overseas. And not only that, to stop them putting their children in Eton, their mistresses in Chelsea, their parents in Harley Street. We actually have sanctions against individuals who are complicit in human rights, and not only from Russia. So I think this is the possibility that those involved in human rights abuses will be targeted and won't be able to use the banks and the casinos and so on.
That goes a long way beyond just sports responsibility.
Yes, but it is worth bearing in mind that sports abusers can be punished in this way.
Interestingly, just the connection there, Jeffrey, because the Michael Garcia report that was done into Russia and Qatar, Garcia couldn't go to Russia because he was excluded from travelling to Russia as a tit for tat because of the Magnitsky Act. It was Putin's response to deny Garcia the ability to travel into Russia, so Cornel Borbely ran that report.
Sorry.
No, Alan, go on.
Well, just on that as well, it's a very good idea to use a Magnitsky Act, and it relates into all of this about the transient nature of so-called human rights improvements. So Jeffrey mentioned, yes, he released all these people in time for Sochi, and then weeks after he was invading Crimea, and he did many things after that. This Magnitsky Act is fascinating you mention it, because you probably know that yesterday, Bill Browder, which was the case Sergei Magnitsky was working on when he was murdered,
from Spain.
right, rang Jeffrey when he was arrested yesterday in Spain by an Interpol notice because the Russians had put a new arrest warrant out for him. So let's get this straight. A kleptocratic regime that has stolen everything is accusing Bill Browder of theft. They get a European country to arrest him under the Interpol rules, which is how it works. Of course, he's then released. But this shows you that you don't get these incremental improvements. And my big fear is that unless we take some more resolute action with Qatar, whatever you're saying in terms of the progress will be transient only. It will not be, will not last, and we need to be much tougher
There
now.
should be an
much tougher now.
independent
Yes,
committee
independent
monitoring
committee
it.
right now, monitoring it
Yeah.
now with sanction capability, including the sanction to remove the World Cup if sufficient improvement is not
Right,
made.
that is what we'd love to see, perhaps. Whether it's going to happen, well, let's wait and see. Jamie, I just want to ask one last point, because I think it's interesting, though we haven't really had time to deal too much on it. Perhaps one of the most significant and impressive gestures that I've seen in the last couple of years was by Juan Mata, the Manchester United footballer, who said, right, I'm committing 1% of my salary to causes for good, basically, in a nutshell. The power of individual sportsmen and women, particularly at the top end, is huge. What role should they be playing in situations the like of which we're discussing here, where human rights, in your view, are being either ignored or worse, abused?
There are so many areas we can go into this. Hope Solo, who was on a panel this morning, we were talking last night. This year is the 50th anniversary of John Carlos and Tommy Smith with the salute in Mexico City in 1968. When you look at the need for athletes to express their voices, but conversely, you then look at US soccer saying that any footballer who takes a knee during the national anthem as a sign of wanting to draw a light to the lack of progress that's been made with respect to civil rights in the United States in that time will be fired. You look at the massively polarising issue in the United States over that very fact. We strongly believe that professional athletes should have their voice, should believe in things and should have their say. And I'd love to see that happen because they are immensely influential. And you touched on it before, so are the brands. The players are influential for the people, the brands are influential for the organisations, for the federations. And it'd be lovely to see both of them get dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century.
Well, people need to have their say as a message here. I think you've all had your say in what's been quite a rumbustious, at times, discussion.
But we're all agreed on the basic.
Which I think is critically important, which my point would be, even if you misbehaved grotesquely at one point in our discussion. To our panel, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
I didn't misbehave.